Well, a very good afternoon. My name is Kasim Kawesa, and welcome back again to my podcast. I really appreciate it. And as for those of you who are looking online, as you can see, in this topic, I'm going to be talking about some of the reasons, some of the advantages, and some of the reasons why talking and sharing how you feel as a man or a boy can be advantageous to you. Um, I think we can all agree we live in a society, especially us here in Britain, where there is a vast majority of us boys and men who do not believe that talking about our feelings and talking about how we feel internally is of an advantage. Either people are going to take advantage of us, either it's going to be used against us, either we've had a like bad experiences in the past where we've been violated, where we've been taken advantage of, or where we've been put in a vulnerable position after sharing how we feel or what is going on for us internally. So I think it's perfectly reasonable and perfectly valid why somebody might refuse and might be reluctant to talk about how they feel internally. But like anything in this world that we live in, there is a yin and yang. There is a positive and a negative. There is a light and darkness. There is also some positives as to why talking about our feelings has an advantage. Now, I would always start off by saying that you have to really talk to the right person. Before many of you will know, I wrote a book called Why Should I Talk About My Feelings? I'm a Man. And before I'd written that book, I essentially used to say the person who you should speak to about your feelings if you're struggling should be your spouse, your partner, and your family member. But after doing research for that book and also writing the prior book before that, which is all about suicide and dark thoughts and so suicidal ideation, I began to realize that some of the worst people to talk about, or to, and which leads to one of the first things to tell your story to, is actually your spouse and your family member. And part of the reason why this is that this linked into one of my other books, which I wrote, which was all about the principal conversations, which is conversations that couples should talk about before they get engaged or before they get married or, they commit to being together a long time. Conversations like how many children should we have? Where should we live? Those sorts of things. They sound very basic, but many couples end up in long-term relationships and end up disappointed, angry, resentful down the road because they didn't actually have these conversations and they engaged in a relationship with somebody who they hadn't clarified some of these things with. And when I was writing that book, it became very apparent that when people sometimes share conversations, particularly around sex, um, or they talk about kinks, or they talk about fetishes, many of the first person who they shared that information with was their spouse. Um, and it didn't go well. Their spouse said they were disgusting, they were horrible, they were pathetic. When I was researching that book, one of the areas which became very apparent to me, and that linked to the suicide book that I wrote about suicidal ideation and dark thoughts, is that there are many boys and men who want to be able to express themselves sexually, in terms of their sexuality, whether they want to be feminine or whatever, however that may present. But unfortunately, when you're in a relationship, particularly I'm talking about heterosexual relationships and even gay and lesbian relationships, there are roles. People expect people to be in a certain way. Now, some people do not have the conversation about this is how I expect you to be, this is how my upbringing was, this is what a man should be. For example, there are some people when they get married that they expect their spouse to stay at home and they are going to be the breadwinner. And some people expect that they're going to be at home and their spouse is going to be the breadwinner. Now, if you haven't had that conversation and it happens, it can be a bit of a shock. There are some people who expect the man to always be the one who initiates sex. And there are some men who, if their wife initiates sex, it's very strange for them. They're not used to being the pursuer, the chaser, the dominant one. Whereas on the opposite side, there are some men who love to be submissive and they want to be dominated, but their spouse or their wife or their partner absolutely finds it disgusting that they would have to play a dominant role. Now, I'm using these because these are extreme examples, but they demonstrate a point, which is that sometimes your needs cannot be met by your spouse. Your story, whether that be your sexual story, your sexual fantasies, the story about trauma, about abuse, sometimes the best person to speak to isn't your spouse and your family member because they will have a narrative or a story or their own interpretation of it. And so what will end up happening is that if you do attempt to try to tell your story, they might not validate your story. They might not accept it. And many of us know this because, as somebody who works as a psychotherapist, it becomes very evident that one of the biggest places of pain for a lot of men and boys is their parents and their carers. Their family is the source of much of the pain that they're experienced. And it's very, very, very difficult because society is conditioned, particularly British society and Western society, has conditioned us, and even when you start adding in religion and cultures, have conditioned boys and men to put their family, in particular the mother, at the top of the hierarchy of value. You cannot in any way criticize, you cannot in any way question how you're parented. You should be grateful that you were parented the way that you were. And so for a lot of people, they end up carrying a lot of pain. They end up carrying their story. They never get to tell their side of the events of what happened to them because it was not going to be validated. And when you don't tell your story, you end up carrying your story. You end up a victim of your story because unless you start telling your story, what ends up happening is that you're gonna not be able to tell it how you want to uh, say it. Sometimes I remember when I wrote my first book, which was what was it entitled? The Best Kept Secret, Unlocking the Raw Inside of Me. I had to actually start telling my story. And as I started telling my story, I began to realize, my God, what happened to me is a lot. I didn't even realize that what had happened to me was that crazy. And it was that, my biological dad dying, being bullied in school, being called monkey, gorilla lips, going to a school where the majority of the people were white and I was the only black person, being in bottom set for my school, ending up homeless, being addicted to porn, ending up an alcoholic, being pepper sprayed by the police, all of these, being in debt, ending up in prostitution, all of these things happening to me. I didn't even realize that they were extreme until I actually started to tell my story. And I was like, my God, this is actually quite bad. And so there is a lot of boys and men out there who haven't been able to tell their story, who haven't been validated. And if you don't get an opportunity to do that, then you don't get to own your story. You don't get to decide to be a survivor until you've told your story. A lot of us, boys and men, what we're doing is we're surviving. We've repressed everything and pushed everything down. We've denied that some of the things that happened to us were that bad. And so what ends up happening is, particularly if we experience trauma, is that ends up manifesting somatically. We end up sick. Or alternatively, what ends up happening is that pain that we experience, what we end up doing is we end up trying to put it out in other forms, whether that is uh, through violence, because those feelings, one of the ways in which this is how you get kids who are bullying, and you get people who engage in violence against women or men, right? We instead of uh, one of the ways in which we get rid of those feelings we put them onto other people, right? Or alternatively, what we end up doing, which is why I had to write the book about suicidal thoughts and dark thoughts, is we end up internalizing it. So one is externalizing, one's internalizing. In other words, we start blaming ourselves, we start punishing ourselves in that we start to drink, we start to self-harm, we start to use drugs, we don't look after our body, we're not hygienic because The way we see it psychologically is if I can punish myself enough and I say I'm not worthy and I'm pathetic and I can degrade myself and I can humiliate myself, then in some way I can resolve this internal pain that I'm experiencing. It's no surprise why so many men are into humiliation and degrading sexually in and those types of kinks, because it's a psychological way of and a controlled way of trying to repair that which we did not receive, whether those were our needs, whether those were our expectations. One of the most disappointing things that I think a lot of boys and men experience is the disappointment of people who are supposed to be their carers and protectors. It's part of the reason why I'm writing this book about why some boys and men abandon their some why some fathers abandon their children. And when you start to look at this, many of those men who abandon their children were also victims themselves. This very same thing that they're doing to their children also happened to them. They're a victim, but they haven't had an opportunity to be listened to. Everyone is either judge them or shame them. You know, when I began off, I said that many boys and men have reasons why they don't talk about their feelings. And one of the reasons is the technique or the tool that society uses as the most common in order to manage men's behavior and to correct them is through punishment, and they use shame. The problem is most people don't understand that when it comes to boys and men, shame does not correct their behavior. It does not motivate them. It does not inspire them to be better people. What it does is the two things that you see with fatherlessness, which is that they either isolate themselves or they run away. So actually, what men need is really empathy, right? They need somewhere private where they can begin to introspect, where they can begin to actually pull the weeds apart and clear the ground and be able to look at, okay, what is my voice and what is the other voice inside of my head? Am I living within the material that I'm carrying? Is it my material or is it my parents' material? Meaning, there are some people who are depressed and they're not depressed because they're depressed, but they're depressed because they picked, when they were younger, they learned that in order to, their parents were depressed and they learned that in order to survive in their family system, they had to pick up their family or their mother or their fathers or their carers' depression or their grandparents' depression, because if they picked it up and carried it, then their parents wouldn't be depressed, which means that they wouldn't be abandoned. Remember that one of the biggest fears that children have is they're going to be left. And if they're going to be left, then who's going to look after them? Right? And if you know, a lot of men, you see this a lot with a lot of boys and men where they're constantly working and working and working and working and working. Many men, when they've gone through grief or when they've gone through pain, one of the ways in which they try to deal with that pain is to become a workaholic. And the problem is, you cannot outwork yourself and your pain. You can anesthetize it, you can ignore it, you can deny it. But the thing is, pain is one of those things which you can't argue about. You can say, I'm not in pain, but you still feel in pain. And the problem is, unless you've had an opportunity to stop, which many men don't want to do, then you can't introspect. You cannot go inwards. And so this is why you see a lot of men, they externalize their issues. Everyone else is to blame, which is why you hear so much in modern society, people say that men don't take accountability. Because in order to take accountability, you've got to own what happened to you, what your actions, what role you had in it, if you even had a role, right? Because in one way or another, there is a lot of people who blame themselves for stuff, right? It's one of the, in fact, let me bring this up faster because then we'll look at it. There is a lot of people who, unless you stop and take a moment and look at yourself, you are going to actually blame yourself. You're going to internalize your pain and your hurt. You were technically a victim. You were a kid, so you could not have controlled the beatings and how you were treated and stuff like that. How could you? You were a child. Maybe you were sexually assaulted, violated in some way. You couldn't have controlled that. And so, because you couldn't blame your parents or your carers or the system, you couldn't control the school you went to if you were being bullied or something like that. What you had to do is you then had to blame yourself. Because if you blame yourself and you reduce yourself, then at least you won't be abandoned. But the problem with that is you lose your essence, you lose your spark, you lose your magic, you lose that sacred part of you, and you diminish it to its smallest capacity in order to fit in order to be liked. This is where you get people who become OCD, where they become control freaks because they have to try to maintain the narrative in which they had to survive in. They can't have plasticity because they were not shown safety by the people who cared for them or should have been the ones to care for them. I'm telling you, man, there is a lot of people out there who blame themselves for things that are not their fault. I remember I was talking to this boy and he said, um if I was good, then my parents wouldn't have divorced. And I said, I don't think that's how it worked. And he said, yeah, I'm to blame. And you can imagine how can a child blame themselves for their parents' divorce? That's adult problems. But there's a lot of people who do. They haven't been able to find a place in which they can process what actually happened to just stop. You see this a lot in the black community. In the black community, you see this with the black woman, where the black woman just can't stop. She can't just stop to actually look at what actually happened to her, what she's been carrying. A lot of people spend their entire lives in survival and they never get to an opportunity or place where they can survive, they can thrive, where they can create, where they can initiate, where they can build something. They're always protecting, defending, and reacting. And I say that, one of the great things about talking about your feelings, especially in therapy, which is where I'd recommend, is that you get that opportunity to be able to start thinking about building because you get an opportunity where someone can actually witness what happened to you and believe you. It's one of the reasons why most people don't talk about what happened to them because either what they went through is mad and crazy and extreme and no one will believe them, or they do not believe that many people will be able to handle what they went through. And it is true. There are some people whose capacity is, or certainly their ability to be able to handle more or what other people's material is more than the average person's. People say to me all the time, Kasim, don't you get depressed hearing people's sad stories? And I'm like, no, not really. Why? Because my capacity to go into my ego state and to go into my narcissism, I'm able to sit with other people's material and have empathy for it and compassion for it without it consuming me. Not everybody can do that. Not everybody can do that. And that's just the truth. That doesn't mean that people don't have different capacities. That doesn't mean that other people are weak, but it does mean that we all have different capacities. There are some people, I was talking to somebody the other day, there are some people who've been through sexual violence or sexual assault, and for them, they can recover within a matter of days and move on with their life. Whereas there's some people who've gone through it and it will crush them. They struggle with mental health issues. They struggle with getting a job. Their health is affected. And it's like, how is that even possible when the same thing happened to you? You get this in families where you got two siblings who were both neglected, both abused by a certain system, whether it's a family system, the judicial system, the healthcare system, and these two different kids turn out completely different. Because why? Part of the reason is because they have different capacities. And if no one has ever witnessed your story, no one has ever listened to you, no one knows what you've been through, it can become heavy. heavy. And the thing is, after a while, you become numb. You don't even realize it. The fish is in water, and the fish doesn't even realize it's in water. It's one of my favorite stories. There are these two fish which are swimming along. They're having banter, they're having fun. In the opposite direction to them is an older fish swimming towards them. As the two fish come close together, the old fish and the old fish says to the young fish, "Good morning, boys. How is the water this morning?" The young fish look at the old fish and they're like, "What a weirdo. What is he going on?" I know fish don't talk, but go with the story. So the boys swim on, and the old fish looks at them, and he carries on swimming. A little while down the road, the one of the young fish looks confused, and so his friend says to him, "What's going on, man? What's wrong with you?" And he says, "No, nothing. Nothing's going on." And he said, "Come on, I know there's something going on. What's the issue?" And his friend says to him, "What the hell is water? When you have been in water your entire life, you do not know any different. Water is like air. You don't even notice it." But there are some people, and you see this in therapy sometimes, when somebody comes in and I'm talking to them about what they've been through, and I'm like, "That's abuse, that's neglect, that's rape," but they didn't know. They didn't have a place where they could explore. Right, I'm going to move forward a minute. The language. They didn't have the language. Imagine you've never heard of the word grief, bereavement, neglect, trauma. If you do not have the language to describe something, then it becomes abstract. It's almost not real. But when you get the language, it empowers you, right? Language empowers you. And I'm going to get back to this later on, because what it does is empowers you to be able to look at your choices, to have autonomy over your life. There's a lot of boys and men who do not think that they have the ability to determine their life. They might have grown up in a family where they've been told, in this family, you're either doctor, lawyer, accountant, or failure. And they don't have the power of words to be able to articulate that they don't want to go down that path. They don't want to do that. They can't. I hear people say to me all the time, "Kasim, I cannot reason with my dad. I cannot reason with my brother. I can't reason with my family." Yes, because they don't have the knowledge, they don't have the skills, they don't have the ability to communicate it. They don't have the words because they don't have the narrative, they don't have the definitions, because they might not have got that from their family. Some people's capacity is bigger and more than their own family system. Not because their family is a bad, but because they have the capacity to achieve more, to dream more, to live more fully, to be more productive, to love deeper, more intensely, at higher consciousness. And it's not because their systems that they've been brought up in are bad intrinsically, but it's just they just have bigger capacity. There are some people whose destinies are bigger than their own systems. But one of the other great things about coming to therapy and talking about your feelings is that you get an opportunity to actually look at what were your responses. Most people don't know why they are the way they don't know why they are the way that they are. When you come to therapy, you get an opportunity to actually look at why are you like this? Is this a personality? Is this a story, a narrative? Is this um, self-esteem? Is this a confidence issue? Is this imposter syndrome? Is this a somatic issue? Are you really, I sometimes meet boys who were neglected physically and they didn't get affection. And they've been brought up in a family with so much stigma about vulnerability that even when a friend of theirs tries to hug them, they're like, "Don't touch me." They're hypersensitive and they don't really know why that is. They don't know why, from a Darwinian perspective or from an evolutionary perspective, their body is very sensitive to being touched. And when you come to therapy, you get an opportunity to be able to look at that, to find out why. The other day I was looking up kinks, which is why I was talking about it earlier on. And I was looking at why some people love humiliation and just, you know, how I did. I basically was really interested in trying to understand why somebody would want to be stamped on and hit and be pegged and stuff like this. And there's a reason. And here's what's really interesting. The people who love degradation and humiliation and to be submissive, usually these men are very powerful and successful. They're used to being in control. And so when you come to therapy, you get to learn, oh, being in control all the time is really, really tiring. And so when you can get an opportunity to be vulnerable and to be able to express, being submissive and dressing up and being kinky is actually BDSM is a way of expressing vulnerability, but in a controlled way. You get to be able to be different versions of you. You get to what in schema therapy is called you get to explore your different parts of yourself. But some people have been brought up in systems where boys and men, where they cannot be different parts of themselves. You have to be stoic. You have to be the man. You have to be my good soldier. Imagine being growing up with a single mum. And not because the mum is bad, but because she needs you to be strong. She needs you to be disciplined, because otherwise you're going to reinforce the stereotypes that people already have about single mums. But what you needed, and you may have needed to do that in order to survive and not to end up in the criminal and a statistic and down that road. And that may have worked when you were younger, but that now may not necessarily work. Um, uh, Particularly being hyper protective of your mother, it might not, or being too close to her, might not work for relationships, for intimacy, for trying to connect with your spouse. The responses and reactions and how you are moving forward, the way you communicate, how your lack of communication might no longer serve you at this point in your life. And so when you come to therapy, you get to look at your responses and you get to look at your choices about how you can choose or not to respond. And I've already talked about naming the emotion. There are some people who don't know what grief is. They don't have that word. They kind of have the feeling, but they don't have a word. And the human mind and the human psyche loves symbolism. It's why we have wedding rings. It's why we have ceremonies, right? People can just get married. You don't need to have a wedding ring. You don't need to have a ceremony, but it's built into the subconscious mind and the collective consciousness. We love symbolism. It's why we love stories. Have you noticed that the same stories keep repeating time and time again throughout human history? Cinderella, you know, Lord of the Rings. Why Star Trek? Why do these stories keep repeating over and over and over again? Because there's something about them that connects with us. The other thing that it does is talking helps you make sense of pain. What a lot of people are missing is meaning. And the thing is, you may have a psychological framework that doesn't allow you or doesn't align with the meaning that you are going to need. And I talk about this in that there are some people, basically, I spent some time studying people who became converts and reverts in different religions. And I began to realize, oh, there are some people who are drawn to Christianity. There are some people who are drawn to Islam. There are some people who are drawn to Buddhism. And I was like, why? And if you look at their narrative and their story, it makes sense. A huge amount of Christianity is shame. It's doing wrong. A huge amount. If you listen to the language in the Bible, it's words like redemption, sacrifice, um, duty. It's all about roles, revelation. So if you find somebody who is lost, somebody who has made a lot of mistakes, somebody who has drifted from their essence, from the center of the self, from who they are, Christianity will really be very good for you. Now, the problem is if you don't know if Christianity exists or you've never listened to that psychological framework because you've rejected anything that is not logical or atheistic or scientific, you may be in a lot of pain, but that psychological framework may not be able to alleviate your pain. You may not be able to draw your meaning from that. You may be somebody who's very logical and everything has to make sense, but if you're coming from a religious standpoint, you may really, really struggle. In fact, some people are in living in a culture or a religious or psychological framework which will not allow for them to be who they are sexually. If you're a lesbian and you're gay and you're in Christianity or Islam, you're not going to be able to be. You're not going to be able to express all of the manifestations of your being in one of those faith positions. That doesn't mean that those faith positions are wrong. It's just that for you as a person, you may not be able to express it because there's an in-group and out-group dynamic that goes on. And so if you don't have the language, you can spend a huge amount of your time in pain because you're not able to express and find meaning in that pain because you don't have the words, you don't have the stories, you don't have the narrative. You are living within an arc or story arc that isn't yours. But also, which means you can't then increase your resilience and decision making. If you're constantly in pain, if you're constantly hurting, if you're constantly struggling, if you're constantly disillusioned, if you're constantly upset, if you're constantly triggered, if you're constantly numb, how in the world can you make decisions about who you want to be? There's so many people when you say to them, what do you want to be? Where would you want to go? They can't even think about that. Not because they're bad, but because they're in so much pain. Their mind is clouded. And as you know, particularly with Buddhism and productivity, to be more productive and to reach enlightenment means letting go. You got to let go of stuff, let go of the past, let go of negativity, let go of possessions, let go of the story that isn't serving you. And you cannot do any of that unless you've got a space in which you can do that. And you have faith and give yourself grace. It takes courage to heal. It takes courage to go and find out what your story is. It takes courage to be able to go and ask for help. Because what will end up happening is what we don't talk about, we end up carrying, and what we carry eventually breaks us, which is why I wrote the book about suicidal thoughts, because some people are so broken by what they went through that they end up dying by suicide, taking their own life. I'm just writing this book about why some fathers abandon their children. And one of the reasons is because some men are gay and they're living within a system in which they cannot be allowed to express that part of themselves. And so the only way that they can be that is to run off to Bali, to a different part of the country in which no one knows them so that they can be who they want to be. They're being broken. And if they aren't broken, one of the reasons why some men abandon their children or they're not in their children's life is because they've committed suicide. They've died by suicide. Hmm? I think it's really important that people understand that courage isn't the absence of fear, is being able to speak about your truth despite it. You don't always have to be the person who has to man up. You can just actually open up to the right people. Boys do cry too. And when we do, we heal. Now, we don't have to cry in order to heal. But I think it's important to understand that talking isn't a sign of a weakness. It's actually a sign of growth, of strength, right? We know that when men talk, boys learn it's safe to do the same. Giving yourself permission to heal, to feel is very, very, very powerful. Mm? And the thing is, you're not alone in feeling these things. To be vulnerable is to be alive, is to reclaim your humanity. I was saying to somebody the other day that the highest act that you can give of another human being is to witness their humanity, their existence. To be seen is the highest act that you can give another human being, which is why therapy is so valuable and is so impactful for a lot of people because they're able to be seen. They are able to understand and explore where they belong. They're able to reclaim the parts of themselves which they left by the West Side, which they neglected, right? There's a poem in which it is said that when we allow ourselves, as we allow our own light to shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same as we're liberated from our fears. And a huge amount of talking about your feelings is you get to actually start alleviating some of your fears. Man, I have to tell you, there is a lot of people a lot of boys and men who are living under fear. Mm. They're not living under opportunity, hope, trust, belief. They're living under fear. Fear of failure, fear of not fitting in, fear of not belonging, fear of being not worthy. And all of that can be expressed and looked at in therapy. But also, this then allows us to have stronger relationships with our partners, with our children, with our friends. It reduces stress, anxiety, burnout. It improves our mental health and just physical health in general. It gives us greater sense of awareness and confidence, right? And as you know, I already talked about this at the very beginning. Fear, a huge amount of why so many boys and men don't come forward is that fear of judgment, lack of role models, culture and family expectations, not knowing where to start. But all of that begins with us. If we can begin to talk about our feelings and grow as a person internally, not just externally, and it allows us to become stronger, more rounded, holistic people. It helps us to ground ourselves. We expand a bit like a balloon expanding. We expand our internal space and our capacity. We exercise it. We push against it. And as we do that, it manifests outwardly to our family, to our friends, to our community, to our workplace, and it becomes a cycle. But the opposite is a snake eating itself as well. So my recommendation is go to therapy. If you can afford it, go to the NHS, ask to see your GP, ask to get a bit of therapy. Ideally, I'd recommend to people you get private therapy if you can, because then you might go towards transactional analysis, which is a type of therapy, Gestalt, Jungian, cognitive behavioral therapy. There are different types of therapy out there, and you may need to find the one that's right for you. You may have had a bad experience with a therapist, but that doesn't mean that therapy doesn't work. You may have tried to share your feelings with somebody in your life and they've betrayed you, judged you, shamed you, but that doesn't mean that everybody's like that. I always say to people that there is help out there, but the help might not come from your blood. They might not come from people who look like you, talk like you, have the same religious position as you. But there are people out there who will help you if you have the courage and the faith to believe that they are out there and they can help you. So thank you very much for listening. I hope this has been useful. Please like and subscribe to my channel and to my podcast. Leave me a comment, send me a message. You know how it is. But otherwise, I hope you have a lovely day and I shall speak to you very, very soon. Bye for now.